Good. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay in the back? Okay, great. Thank you for the invitation to present at this forum today. It's really exciting. I've known Amy for a while, and I've been very familiar with the work that's going on here, and I think it's really quite remarkable. And so it's wonderful that you are all able to gather today to learn more about what's happening here, as well as some broader things happening elsewhere. And I'm very happy to share some of the findings from our project. This is my first visit to Australia and to Sydney, and I've had a great time. I've really enjoyed getting to know your city a little bit, and I hope come back again because there's clearly a lot to do and see that I will not have time to do before I leave this weekend. So I'd like to begin by saying just a little bit about the program that we have at the University of Massachusetts, because it was actually made possible by the generosity of a couple, Andrew and Virginia Rudd, who are adoptive parents. One of their daughters was an undergraduate student at our university, and adopted. They have 4 children, 2 by adoption and 2 by birth. And their daughter was a student at our university and had a good experience. And when she graduated, they wanted to make a gift to the university to make it possible for there to be a center that would be involved in the creation of new knowledge about adoption, but importantly, the dissemination of knowledge. Because they were aware that when they were raising their children, they had many questions about how to do it best with adopted children, and they went to various practitioners and encountered a lot of people who are not what we would call adoption competent. But they knew that there was a lot of work out there that could be used, and they wanted to facilitate that. So that's really the goal of the program that they founded with this generous gift to the university. And I had the great honor and privilege of being the first person to come in and begin this program 11 years ago. This is our 10th anniversary cake from our conference last year. We had a big celebration and conference. And this is just a quick overview of our mission. First of all, to advance knowledge about the psychology of adoption through original research. And the project I'll be talking about today is the one highlighted on the left, the Minnesota-Texas Adoption Research Project. We also mentor the next generation of adoption-competent researchers. And here you see pictured undergraduate, graduate, and postdoctoral students who work in our program, who take courses with us and learn about adoption, and they are the future researchers in this field. We also engage with the community and community partners to incubate and implement and evaluate programs. So on the left, you see an illustration of our adoption mentoring partnership, which we have with Big Brothers Big Sisters in our local communities. So we identify college students at the university who themselves were adopted and volunteer to be mentors for children in the community who are 8 to 12 years old, who themselves were adopted. And many of those younger kids don't know other children who were adopted, don't really have a good understanding of what that might mean for their future. But by pairing them with a college student, they have a chance to talk about what adoption means and to experience the friendship and relationship of someone that they'll know hopefully for the rest of their life. So we've been working with that program. And on the right, you see an illustration of the Treehouse community, which is about 45 minutes from the university, which is an intergenerational intentional community of families who've adopted children from care, who live together in a community to support one another as they're raising these children. But there are elders who've moved there. Many of them are single women who have raised their own children. Some of them, their husbands have passed on, and they live there to support this community. So it's really a very innovative and amazing place, and the outcomes for the children there are quite good. I'd be happy to talk more about either of these programs with you at the break or afterwards. We also provide evidence-based knowledge to inform adoption practice policy, and here you'll see some of our keynote speakers from our conferences, Drs. Megan Gunner, Mary Dozier, and Philip Fisher, all of whom have done outstanding work in the field of adoption research. We also disseminate this work on our website, and here you see an illustration of our publication series on the future of adoption. We have 18 articles on our website available for free download to anyone at any time, and I'd encourage you to take a look at those in the event that some of them might be useful to you. And we can make these slides available if people are interested. Finally, we are dedicated to creating an adoption-friendly campus at the University of Massachusetts. Our chancellor talks about the importance of our university being a destination of choice for different kinds of students. And what we're trying to do is create an environment so that students who've had an experience of adoption and or foster care feel that they are at home, that they have people who understand them, that they have opportunities for taking courses. I teach an undergraduate course on the psychology of adoption and another one starting actually next Wednesday on foster care. And we also have parent groups for staff and faculty who are adoptive parents and various opportunities for undergraduate students to work as well. So today I'm going to talk very briefly about adoption in the U.S. context, just to give you a sense of how it might be similar and different from what you have here in Australia, and then talk about some of the results from our 30-year longitudinal study with a focus on how adoptive and birth family members navigate their relationships over time. So to just begin with adoption in the United States, our population approximately 327 million. We have about 1.5 million adopted children at any time in our country under the age of 18. One of the complicating factors we have that's similar to your situation is that the country is divided into states which prize their autonomy and do things somewhat differently from each other. And adoption law, because it's part of family law, is considered primarily a state matter. So states vary in terms of specific policies and practices, although there are some federal laws that overarch the state laws, but a lot of the work on the ground is done at the state level. Just briefly about our children in our care system, we have currently about 443,000 children in foster care. These are the most current statistics. Their average age is about 8.5 years, roughly half males and females, and overrepresentation of non-white children in the care system. They are typically in care for an average of 20 months, and 123,000 of those children are actually awaiting adoption. So it's been determined over the course of time that the idea of children staying in foster care for long periods of time, going from one home to another without the possibility of returning to their family, can be very difficult and damaging for children. And so our government a number of years ago put in place some time frames, always encouraging family reunification first. But if it becomes evident that family reunification or restoration is not possible, then the court can move to terminate the parental rights and make it possible for the child to be adopted. So there are currently 123,000 children in that situation, and in any given year, about half of them will actually be adopted. The numbers in care and the numbers awaiting adoption have been rising over the past 5 years. Part of that is due to the opioid epidemic and the increase in chemical dependency and all the things that go with that. Currently in the U.S., we have 3 primary kinds of adoptions. The upper right-hand corner, the blue wedge, represents domestic infant adoption. So these are placements not where the child was removed from by the authorities, but rather where the child's birth parents, usually birth mother, determined that they felt they were not able to provide the kind of home that they wanted for their child. They were not forced adoptions in the sense that we talk about here in Australia, but I would say that in certain ways they were forced by circumstances, because many of these young women did not have extended family who could help with the rearing of the children. Our social safety net in the United States is not strong, and so it's very difficult for people to get benefits, especially if they're single parents and do not have the kind of education that will get them a good job. So many of these women felt that first of all, they wanted their child to be raised in a 2-parent family. Many of them, or most of them, did not want to seek an abortion, and they also wanted a better chance for their child. So that's about 14,000 a year, and those are fairly steady. And I realize that's very atypical for here. but it is a kind of a part of what we have. The international adoptions into the United States have been declining rapidly over the past 15 years, as they have been around the world. So in 2004, I think we had 24,000 international adoptions from all countries. Now it's down to 4,000 a year and declining, and I think it will continue to decline for a number of reasons, and we can go into that later if you would like. The number of adoptions from the child welfare system, these are children adopted from care, is now 60,000 per year and growing. This is the sector that we really need to be paying even more attention to in the future, and so that's why I think some of the work that's going on here will be very informative to us in terms of learning about those kinds of adoptions. In many ways, we're moving from an old paradigm in which adoption is viewed as kind of a subtraction of child from one family and addition to another, to what we think of as an adoptive kinship network, a more inclusive idea in which the child really forms a connection, a permanent connection, between their family of birth and their family of adoption. And even if all the family members don't know one another personally, there is a psychological connection, a psychological membership in both families. Just to say a word about trends in the United States, in the private agency infant adoptions that I mentioned, currently about 55% of them involve direct contact between adoptive and birth family members. About 40% of them involve mediated contact, which means that there is communication, but it is de-identified, and it usually goes through a third party at the agency. And only about 5% of adoptions are closed. So it's now becoming quite unusual. Contact in child welfare adoptions from care is definitely increasing. And when it's not possible with birth parents because of safety issues, it often includes birth siblings and grandparents and other extended family. Contact in international adoptions is also on the rise, but it very much depends on the child's country of origin and what's possible given the geopolitical dynamics and the nature of those particular countries. So in a typical domestic infant open adoption, a birth mother who's decided that she wants to find a placement for her child, she may go to an adoption agency, talk to the counselors there, talk about her various options, and then really work with the staff there to select an adoptive family for the child. So there are many more couples who want to adopt, couples and individuals. So we have couples adopting, married couples, single individuals, gay and lesbian couples. So we have, many different kinds of people are wanting to adopt, and there's much more demand than there is the number of children available. And so birth parents have an opportunity to have some say into that placement. And then direct contact often happens between birth family and adoptive family members, sometimes sometimes before the placement, but sometimes at the child's birth or soon at the placement. In many of these cases, agreements are put into place, post-adoption contact agreements, or sometimes they're called post-adoption communication agreements, which kind of spell out the commitments that the adoptive and birth family members are making to one another about how frequently they will have contact, what kind of contact they will have, and so on. These agreements in some states are informal and not considered legally binding, but in some states, for example, in my state of Massachusetts, they are considered legally binding, and so if one party or the other doesn't keep their commitment, they can go to mediation, and the mediator might then say, well, sit down with everybody and say, well, what happened? Why are you not keeping this commitment? And then possibly renegotiate it, require the other person to have contact. But these agreements cannot undo the adoption. So even if one party does not keep their agreement, it will not undercut the adoption. There's a lot, this is a very new area, and there's a lot more to be learning, and actually I want to do some research in this area to see how those are working out. But the day-to-day dynamics within the families are really worked out by the participants themselves with little professional support. So this is one, it's like once the adoption is finalized, the agreements are made, and everyone is launched, then they're kind of on their own. Although there are some post-adoption services available in the community, but some of those service providers have more understanding of openness than others do. So by and large, they're left to their own situation. But in any case, the adoptive parents are the legal parents and have all full legal parenting rights and responsibility. These contacts may include meetings. They may include phone calls, social media like Facebook. They may include Skype and Zoom and all of those kinds of things, exchange of pictures and gifts and so on. They may involve a variety of people. Sometimes they may involve just the adoptive and birth parents. Sometimes they may involve extended family members, grandparents, aunts, uncles, siblings, and so on. They may vary in frequency. So the contact actually, and I'll explain a little bit about why that might be, but contact could be very frequent. We have some families where they get together several times a month. They live in the same community. They really come and go very freely from each other's homes, just as you would with certain extended family members. But we have other cases in which their relationships are more kind of distant. They maybe connect once or twice a year around birthdays or holidays or something like that. There may be these verbal or written agreements that they have, but the thing that we have definitely learned is that these relationships will change over time, because the people in the relationships change, the kids grow up, the adults, new people enter the family, people leave the family, people change jobs, they move from one community to another, so things do change. And I think that whatever kind of agreements they make need to make some kind of allowance for that, if possible. Initially, when we started our work, so we began our work actually, as Amy said, in the 80s, kind of at the tail end of the closed adoption era, and some of the adoption agencies were beginning to start making it possible for birth and adopted parents to have contact with one another, especially at placement. But my colleague Ruth McRoy and I received a phone call one day from a director of an agency who said, we're starting to do this, but we're nervous. We don't know. I mean, we think it's going to be a good thing, but we're not really sure. Can you all help us and do some research for us? And so we started by doing a small pilot study for this agency, which then grew to a much larger national study. But the reason that people were nervous is, first of all, concerns were expressed on behalf of the children, that they would be confused, that if they had these adopted parents and birth parents, that they wouldn't know who their real parents were, and they wouldn't understand or be able to differentiate that. And that confusion could lead then to other kind of subsequent problems for the kids. There were also concerns about the adoptive parents, that they may feel intruded upon, that they may feel that they can't kind of feel the entitlement to be full parents of that child, and that also it would be bad for birth parents because they would experience kind of continuing grief and continuing sense of loss every time they saw their child. Now, one thing I will say about these three concerns that our research has shown is that none of these concerns are accurate in terms of what our data have been showing. In other words, the children are not confused. Children can differentiate between parental figures with different roles. The adopted parents are not really feeling intruded upon, and of course they are entering into this voluntarily. And we found that the birth parents, actually the ones who had contact, had the least sense of unresolved grief, because they knew that their child was safe, they knew that their child was being cared for, and that's really, the birth mothers who had the worst time were the ones in the closed adoptions who had no idea where their child was. They had no idea if their child was alive or healthy. So anyway, we've been able to kind of address all of these issues to different degrees, and we'll talk about some of them today. And of course, there's some added concerns about adoptions from care. about adoptions from care. Let me just take a sip here. Especially with the children, that there are additional safety risks so that the children are not exposed again to maltreatment or re-traumatized, and concerns among adoptive parents about fears of intrusion that may involve safety for the child and family, and for birth parents, additional feelings of anger or shame or guilt, and so on. There are also additional concerns for international adoptions that raise even. But I want to return now and talk today about the focus of our project, which is on domestic infant adoption. So I realize this is not the predominant kind of placement happening here in Australia, but I hope that some of our findings, and I think that some of our findings are relevant for you, and I hope that we'll be able to have time at the end for discussion of some of those things. So we began our study in the mid-1980s, and several people have asked me, well, how did you kind of conceptualize a 30-year study? Well, I will admit we didn't really think of it at the beginning as a 30-year study. We started, as I mentioned, with this small pilot study for that agency. And then after we did that, it's like, oh my gosh, this is so important and so fascinating. We need to do something more. So we did a bigger study of these younger children, during which we actually were able to interview the children. And then after we kind of finished that and kind of caught our breath and kind of re-centered a little bit, it was like, wow, these kids are teenagers now. What happens next? So then we applied for funding and we, did that. And then it was like, okay, well, we made it through the adolescent years, but now these kids are going to college and they're graduating and they're starting to have children. We've got to find out about that. So one thing has kind of led to another, but now we're at the point of having this 4-wave of study. When we saw the children in middle childhood, adolescence, emerging adulthood, and young adulthood. And so I want to organize my talk today around those 4 age periods and talk about how these relationships get navigated. When we started, we had about 1/3 of our adoptions were the closed confidential adoption. About 1/3 were what we call mediated, meaning that there is communication that is de-identified, and about 1/3 were fully disclosed open adoptions. So we had kind of an interesting comparison point built into our study. And our participants, we have 190 adoptive couples. So we were recruiting adoptive parents through these agencies. These were all heterosexual married couples. At that time, there were not many gay or lesbian couples who were adopting through agencies. It was not really permitted at that point in time. And their profile of these couples was fairly typical for what was happening in the U.S. In the late 70s and early 80s. So most of them were white, most of them were middle to upper middle class. Most all of them were adopting because of infertility. They were around the age of 40 at the time of our first wave. We focused on one target child per family, and we followed those children on through time. Most of the children were placed in early infancy, some of them directly out of the hospital, some of them within a couple of weeks of birth. We did not include any transracial or international or special needs children in our sample. And it's not because we weren't interested in them, but it's because our focus was on contact and variations in contact. And the more layers you add to what you're trying to understand, if you add, the issues about growing up in a family of different racial backgrounds or international, that makes it more difficult to understand what's going on. So we limited our sample for the purpose of having some depth in understanding contact, but of course that also limits our generalizability to broader populations. So it's a trade-off, and that was the decision that we made at that point. We also interviewed 169 birth mothers, so Not all of them are the birth mothers of the children in our samples. Many of them are, but we also have some other birth mothers as well. But they were between the ages of 14 and 36 at placement. So these, and the average age at placement was 19 years. So these are not primarily teenage mothers, young teenage mothers. These are women who are, 18-ish, 19, young women, but who have made this decision to make an adoption plan for their child. We call these voluntary placements, but again, I put quotations around the word voluntary because I think many of these women felt forced by circumstances to seek an adoption. If they had better support from their families or from the community, they may have chosen differently. But mainly they wanted the best possible future for their child. I want to say a thanks to our research team, and especially to my colleague of all these years, Dr. Ruth McCroy. I know some of you in this audience may have heard her speak at other conferences or met her. Ruth and I we go way back to the very beginning of this, and she recently retired for the second time. From the second university. She retired once from the University of Texas about 10 or 15 years ago, and then she went to Boston College and started just doing some consulting there, and then they said, wow, why don't you do some teaching here? And then all of a sudden she was in a full-time position, and then she said, okay, I'm going to retire again. And she assures me that this is the last time. But anyway, Ruth and I have had a great journey together, and we're still in constant communication about our project here. Many other research colleagues that I express my appreciation, as well as to our funders, who are a mix of federal government sources and private foundations. So, on to the navigating contact between adoptive and birth family members over time. So I'm going to begin with the first phase, which I call placement to middle childhood. And I think of this as figuring out the relationship dance, because I think what's happening in contact during this early phase is that the adults are really needing to figure out what it means to have this new complex kind of family. The families in our study are what I think of really as pioneers, because they were the first to begin having these open relationships. It was very unusual. There were no guidebooks, no manuals, no instructional handouts. It was really kind of work to kind of figure it out as you go. And as the pioneers, they now have made it possible for next generations of families to learn from their experiences. I want to begin with consideration of what adoptive parents may be thinking, because the way they frame their family has implications for how they behave and how they consider this interaction. So do the adoptive parents, are they able to acknowledge the child's dual connection to their adoptive and birth family? And what does it mean for them to be in a relationship with the child's other mother? And one thing we've clearly seen is the relationship between the child's birth mother and adoptive mother. That relationship is really pivotal, because both of those women really need to figure out how to make space for each other with distinctive roles in that extended family, and not competing roles, but distinctive and complementary roles. But again, in the absence of a guidebook or any kind of instruction manual, it's challenging, and it really depends on each person. Here's a quote that illustrates the mindset of an adoptive mother who is having no contact and really wants none. So she says, "My job is to protect my daughter and do what is best for her, and to give her the most stable, normal life there is. My goal is that she would never feel any different or think of herself any differently than Joey, her older biological son. This gives a level of normalcy, stability, unity, and cohesiveness that I'm very quick to defend and very protective over." So her mindset really is that she is the child's mother. She is in charge of this adoptive family, and that is the way it is. So not a lot of permeability there toward having a different kind of more open relationship. But in contrast, here's an adoptive mom who had frequent contact with her child's birth mom. She says, to me, when you're going into adoption, you have to be willing to accept the fact that the biological parents are in the picture. And if they're not in the picture, you wouldn't have a child. That's just the bottom line. And to recognize that, and that they have rights too, to know that their child is alive and well and healthy and being taken care of. So you see a really different kind of way of conceptualizing these relationships. We also have to think about what the birth parents are thinking. Have they accepted the finality of the placement? How might their sense of loss or anger or shame or guilt their positioning in this emerging relationship? And what does it mean for them to be in a relationship with the child's other mother? So again, it's, trying to understand what both of them are thinking is really important. But as we then think about what's going on in their heads, it's like, how do they start to dance? How do they regulate emotional distance within the family, within these new relationships? I think of this process of navigating this new relationship as one that involves, each of us has kind of a comfort zone of interaction as we meet new people, say as we start a new job or as we have a new family relationship or something like that. That there are some people that you meet initially and it's like, wow, I want to get to know this person better. We seem to hit it off well, and one thing leads to another, and then a relationship really blooms. There are other people that you get to meet. It's like, oh, okay, nice to meet you. Well, things are fine. And so that dance kind of begins, and each person kind of has to figure out how to make that proceed. But adoption often pulls people out of their comfort zones in terms of trying to figure this. It's like some people may want to move more quickly into a new relationship, and other people may be a little more, think of them as slow to warm up or a little more guarded, and maybe over time they both get to the same destination, but they may not be in sync. So thinking about how that happens is something we saw our family struggling with. Here's a really nice quote from an adoptive mom in an open who describes that dance beautifully. She's talking about the child's birth mother, and she said, "We used to write daily and call each other weekly in the beginning. When the children were real little, it was tremendous intensity. And I think as our birth mother," notice the language, as our birth mother became more secure in herself and went on to finish college, her need to see them once a week or once a month became less and less. And she feels more comfortable with us, we feel more comfortable with her, and we just know that we always have access. You just take it one day at a time. If you want it to work, you'll work at it. We feel it's healthy, and we want it to work because of our children. So she is clearly illustrating this dance, this process that's going back and forth, and talks about how it developed gradually over time. One of the concerns that adoptive parents have initially, and that people had on behalf of adoptive parents, was the fear that the birth mother might try to reclaim her child, despite the fact that the adoption was court-ordered. In the beginning, people were most afraid that this would be a reality in the open adoption, because the birth mother knows where the child lives, knows where the family lives, and she could come. There was also this irrational fear that people talked about of a child being, a family being in a shopping mall and with a child, and then the birth mother hiding behind a potted palm or something and coming out and taking the child. So there were these really irrational kind of things that were going on. So we looked at this. We asked adoptive and birth parents about this fear. And what we found is that the least fear of reclaiming was in the open adoptions. And it was because they actually had a personal relationship with each other. And many of the adoptive and birth parents had even spoken with each other about this, and kind of put each other's minds at ease. The greatest fear was in the case of the closed adoptions, where people were operating on the basis of stereotypes and horror stories that were in the media and things like that. So that was one thing we saw at our first wave. We also saw a very poignant difference in the contact needs of adoptive parents and birth parents. So for adoptive parents, we saw that at the beginning, they kind of want to establish some boundaries around their family. Many of them, as I said, they adopted because of infertility. So for many of them, this child was their first child. They were very excited. They waited a long time. And so part of what happens is you want to say, here's our family. We're establishing some boundaries here. But at the same time, the birth mothers place the child and they're anxious. They want to know, did I make the right decision? Is my child okay? Is this going to work out? Do I trust these people? So they have kind of diverging pathways of needs for contact. And that's something I think that's also important for people to realize. And now that we know that, we can talk to people about that as a possibility, help them be aware of that. Of course, there are many benefits of contact that we found in this early phase. Children know the truth about their family. They have access to ongoing information, not only health information, but ongoing information about who's in the family, what are they doing, and so on. For many of them, they experienced a larger family circle of love and caring, more people to come to birthday parties, more gifts, and all those things. But also the idea of adoption and contact can be normalized from an early age. But then the kids hit adolescence, which is, another really different time period, and of course a lot of emphasis at that point is about fitting in and not being different. So in the teenage years, we found that most of the kids, they want to feel normal, and when we interviewed them, they use that word normal. I want to be normal. I'm from a normal family. I don't want to be seen as being different or from some different kind of situation. And they're busy. They're busy with their friends, they're busy with school, with their activities. They have very full lives. They're becoming more independent, but also being connected. And they're going through all the stuff of adolescence and teenage years, which is complicated enough, not even considering the additional challenges of being in an open adoption or being in an adoptive family. So plenty of room for complication during those years. We asked the teenagers in our study to rank order for us 6 different areas and tell us how important those areas were. Because, as adoption professionals, we often think, adoption is the most important thing because we're living and breathing and thinking about it all the time. But what do the kids think? So we asked them to tell us how important these 6 areas were: occupational future, their friendships, religion or spirituality, their health, their family in the future, and adoption. And you may not be surprised to learn that adoption came in dead last. So here's a little bar graph showing on the left, rank 1 is the most important. So only 5 teenagers ranked adoption as their most important thing. 87 ranked it as the least important thing. And when you put rank 5 and 6 together, that's 80% of the adolescents said that adoption was either last or next to last in importance. And the area that was most important, what do you think? Friends. They're friends, most important. There are 2 things that I want to highlight about teens in these relationships. We asked them, if you could ask your birth parents 3 things, what would they be? The most important thing that the teenagers want to know is why. Why was I adopted? Why am I in this family? And of course they all know at one level, they all know why they're adopted. They all have a story. Their parents read them stories, told them stories from the time they were little. So they know at one level, they know why, they know their story, but they want to know really why. Really, what were my birth parents thinking? What were their lives like at that time? What was going on for them? And even underneath that is really, did you love me? You know, did you love me, or were you rejecting me? That's really what they want to know. Was I rejected, or was I really placed for adoption, as I've been told, because you cared for me? They want to know about that, whether they were cared for or not. That's what they want to know. The other complicating thing that happens during adolescence is about family events and how they get structured, especially as kids move toward graduation from secondary school. Who's going to be invited to the graduation? Are birth family members considered part of the family? For some of them, their birth mother got married along the way, because most. So does she invite one of the adopted children to be in the wedding party? How does that work out? So figuring out the logistics of all that is also important. And I want to mention just a couple of challenges in the contact. One we saw was sometimes the meetings were uncomfortable. So here is an adolescent being interviewed. And where did this meeting take place? At the mall. It was in a pizza place, and we were just eating. And was that an arranged meeting, or did you just run into her, the birth mother? It was arranged. And what happened? Well, we talked, and I felt really uncomfortable. What do you think made you feel uncomfortable? Well, I don't know. She cried, and she was hugging me, and it was just weird. More than you'd like to have it? Yes. So teenagers don't want to feel weird. They don't know what to do when the adults in their life have emotional kind of situations they can't interpret or understand. So there were some uncomfortable meetings. There were also challenges with letter exchanges. So here we asked an adolescent about how they felt about receiving or not letters, and they said, well, I had no problem with receiving them. It's sending them that's a problem, because I don't know what to say. I don't know what she expects me to say. I don't know the impression I'm giving from the letter, because I know the impression I'm trying to give, but it's not always there, because it's a letter and you don't get to hear the sound of your voice. So it's like, and put yourself in the position of a 14-year-old trying to write a letter to their birth mother. How do you really express what you're feeling? Inconsistency and broken promises were another big issue. Here's a case where an adolescent said, well, I'd asked my dad why he did that, because I called him on the phone and he said, all right, I'll give you a call tomorrow, and he never did. I'd ask him why he did that and why my mom doesn't call anymore and never writes. So kids are acutely aware of inconsistencies and broken promises. And I'm going to skip a couple things here. But one of the things that our adolescents did note is that the contact can be really good, but it also is complicated. So here's a young woman who says, the contact has been such an awesome experience, and it's like hard, I guess. You have to always consider everyone else's feelings. So there is an emotional layer to this that often takes the kids out of their zone that their other peers may be, in terms of needing to be mature and think more expansively about their family. What does it take to make contact work? It takes adult commitment, keeping promises, sensitivity to the preferences of the child, realization that the teen years can be tough in any case, and sensitivity to the idea that contact may make kids feel not normal. I'm going to say just a word about emerging adulthood, which is this age 18 and late 20s. The young adult years when kids are not, they're not adolescents anymore, but they're not fully adults. There's a lot of kind of going back and forth. And let's see. The main questions here that our young people had were different. Remember, at adolescence, the question was about why. At emerging adulthood, the question really is about their medical and genetic background information, partly because many of these young people are now starting to think about starting a family, getting married, and so on, and they realize I don't really know that much about my birth family. Even if they have contacts sometimes, they don't know that much about the medical and family health information. So that was another issue. Here's a young adult who said, I'd like to have a little more medical history. I'm just curious, especially now that I have a child. Okay, so I'm going to move ahead actually to, got a lot of, so one thing about the kinship network dynamics at this age is that we did find that the adoptive parents typically step back and let the young adult decide how much contact they want to have. So up to that point, it was largely orchestrated by the adoptive parents. But when the child turns 18, typically they step back and let the young have more of that decision making. We also found that the young adults' partners begin to have a say in this, because for some of them, especially who were either engaged or thinking about getting married or something, their new partner might say, well, tell me about this, your birth family or the other side. And they said, well, I don't really know much about them. What do you mean you don't know? You know, it's like, if I'm going to marry you, I want to know something about your whole family, and not that. So sometimes their partners may be driving their interest in connecting or getting information. And also the idea of grandparents comes in, because once these young adults start having children, then they have not only their adoptive parents become grandparents, but their birth parents become birth grandparents. And so then there are dynamics between adoptive grandparents and birth grandparents on the one side and the adoptive parents, so it just becomes more complex. And it's all manageable. It can all be worked out. But again, there aren't any kind of rule books for this or any manuals that come along with this. And in young adulthood, we see even kind of more of this. What I want to do is skip ahead to my last slide, which is really about touch points for practice, because I know many of you are practitioners, and hopefully some of these ideas are things that can resonate with you in your work. So first, I'd like to just recall this idea of the importance of reframing family in terms of the child's dual connection to both birth and adoptive family. And we have found really that for everyone concerned, when they are able to take that point of view or that perspective, it seems very helpful. And having that as their framework for family, from that flows their feelings, their behaviors, their ways of interacting. It provides a framework that is different from the framework that most families operate under. So that's one point I'd like you to kind of take home. Another is sometimes these relationships are challenging. They're tough. I mean, they're complicated, all of that thing. And often it's necessary for parents to kind of step back and remember, why am I, and they may even ask themselves, why am I doing this? Why did I sign up for this? What is going on? They have to remember that it's in the best interest of the child. That has got to be kind of the central, point, and a kind of a compass that they can return to when times get tough. It's like, why did I take this on? It's because I know in the long run it's really best. So that's another kind of touchstone that can be helpful in working with families. A third one is the importance of the adults working together to the degree that that's possible. Because where family happens is in the day-to-day stuff on the ground, right? It's in how people get together, how they spend their time, how they communicate, who's doing what on the holidays. It's all of those kind of mundane daily life things. And that involves communication, it involves flexibility, it involves keeping commitments and being consistent. And often it involves being a little more, sometimes it's not an equal 50-50 kind of thing. One person may have a little bit more. Next to last is the idea of listening carefully to the child. Because even though the parents may think, well, I'm doing this in the best interest of the child, if the child is really experiencing a lot of distress about it, maybe it's good to kind of step back a little bit, regroup, figure out what's going on. And then finally, providing ongoing support when needed by adoptive and birth family members. In the U.S., we now have a movement toward what's called adoption-competent mental health and child welfare practice. And I don't know if that's here at this point, but it is a movement that may well come here if it's not here yet. But the idea that people who are doing direct practice in fields that are not directly in adoption, like teachers and physicians and nurses and so on, that they also understand some of these issues about adoption that can help them in working with kids and families as they go. So thank you very much for your interest this morning. I know we'll have a little time for Q&A now, and I'll be around all day and we'll be happy to talk to you.